Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Gessel, and I'm the Director of Public Programs at Museum of the African Diaspora in San Francisco. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the challenging circumstances that we're all in, and I hope that everyone in the audience today is safe and healthy. I want to welcome you to MOAD Online and to our Community Resilience series. Each week, we'll be looking at how we as a community are resilient in the face of the global pandemic. This program is being live streamed on our MOAD YouTube channel and Facebook Live, and a recording will be made available on the MOAD YouTube channel after the close of the program. Please do use the Q&A box to submit questions for the panelists. You can also use the chat, and the questions will be addressed towards the end of the program. Please stay tuned at the end as well so you can see how you can help support MOAD. Today, we will be discussing the importance that women of color play in American politics and how the democratic process is under attack during this global pandemic. And we'll be talking with Aimee Allison and Davey D. Aimee Allison is the founder and president of She the People, a national network of women of color. She hosted the nation's first presidential forum for women of color in 2019 and leads national efforts to build inclusive multiracial coalitions led by women of color. She's appeared in hundreds of media outlets, including Politico, New York Times, and PBS. Aimee Allison holds a BA and MA from Stanford University. And in conversation with her is her longtime friend, Davey D. He is the longtime host of Hard Knock Radio, which is the intersection of hip hop and politics, which can be heard in various cities around the country. He also teaches over at San Francisco State in the Africana Studies Department and is a longtime journalist and hater of okra. Davey D is Team Brussels sprouts. Welcome, Aimee and Davey.
Thank you.
Hey, I don't like okra. I'm a Brussels sprouts guy, you know. Anyway, how you doing, Aimee?
I'm good. I'm so honored to be here and honored to be a guest of the Museum of the African Diaspora. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and the whole team over there.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody that is here. So let's jump into this conversation because there's a whole lot of moving parts as we're zooming in on the 2020 November election. And the narrative has been for the past year or so, and your organization playing a key role, is the significant role that women, Black women, women of color have been able to play in various elections. And you've been pushing really hard to bring that into the forefront. Let's talk a little bit about that, because one would think that that would be an automatic no-brainer, but there's still a lot of pushback. And it seems like from where I sit, folks are looking at the proverbial prize, which would be the soccer mom in the Midwest. That's who we got to capture. And it's good that we got Black women in the inner city, but that's who we want. So talk about the contrast in narratives and what's really going on.
Let's remember 2016. Seems like a long time ago, doesn't it? In 2016, women of color had already been the backbone of the progressive vote in this country for 50 years. And yet, both parties were acting as if we didn't exist. There was a shock when people looked at the results of the election and how Trump got into power. And it was the first time that there was a recognition that there is no such thing as the women's vote. There's no such thing. That race is a bigger determinant to voting than gender is. And that women of color are a unique, very savvy set of organizers and political players. And Black women who hadn't been acknowledged in 2016 were the highest turnout of any race and gender. And the vote eligible numbers of Latinas in swing states like Texas or Arizona were incredibly potent, as well as the fastest growing voting bloc, which is Asian American women. Even in places that are considered red states, Native women were driving change and progressive change and activism. all across the board, women of color who hadn't been acknowledged in 2016 were the key. And I formed She the People because we had to acknowledge the unique and very important contribution that women of color had been making, but also will make. We delivered the House for the Democrats in 2018, in large part because our turnout increased 37%, and that took Democrats over the line. And looking forward to November, it's women of color in swing states like Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Texas that will be the margin of victory. So when you say soccer moms, I think that's an old trope. It's really a fiction. White women have been conservative voters voting for Republicans for a long time, and most do. Women of color, majority of them are progressive voters and vote for Democrats. And so that is a fundamental difference. It isn't going after the conservative or moderate white women. It's making sure that women of color, everyone that's eligible, votes in highest numbers possible this year. That's going to make the difference.
So let me ask you this, and we've talked about it. You know, I've been around the country. I watch a lot of these, and I covered a lot of these elections. And yeah, everything you're saying is true, and it's been increasing. But we still see a reluctance. We still see, you know, kind of like a dragging of the foot to really go all out and take the narrative that you were talking about to higher levels. And I'm still trying to figure out why. And again, I come back to, just from what I watch, this focus on, we don't want to anger, we don't want to make uncomfortable these soccer moms who we really want to get as well. And so let's talk, you know, why do we have the pushback and not the all-out enthusiasm that we've seen generated with the forums that you were doing?
Well, we have to tell the truth. This is a time for too much is at stake not to. And the truth is that the American political system was built to privilege whiteness, particularly white men. And it was never built for us. And yet, women of color have been, since the beginning of this country, at the forefront of expanding the franchise. Who has access to full citizenship and voting rights. And the pushback that we find is really a combination of relying on an institution that wasn't built and the assumption that white voters are the voters to get, particularly for Democrats. That's been the center, a driving force for what candidates get the thumbs up and the support from gatekeepers, where money goes, what voters are prioritized, the whole system of politics. And so when we say women of color are the most progressive voting force in this country, it's actually news to people from progressive points of view, from liberal organizations, from Democrats. I mean, it's news because in awareness that racism has blinded people, no matter what their political stripes are, to the power of 20% of the population. And when I started this effort and I said, look, women of color together, it's not a racial identity, it's a political identity of solidarity in a country that's becoming majority people of color, that in solidarity with one another, we are a voting bloc that is 25% or higher in 7 states, actually more states in the South and Southwest, that will make the difference in the 2020 election. People are like, wait, even amongst women of color, it was news. I didn't realize we were that powerful. And now what we have to do is we have to act on that, consolidate and act on that power. That the center of gravity needs to be women of color, because women of color sit at the intersection between gender justice, economic justice, racial justice, and social justice. And if we're going to be able to create the kind of country that we can imagine, we have to start with and center our work on women of color. And that means that white voters, particularly moderate and conservative white voters, are not the center in the middle of everything, because that's not where transformation will come from. and that understanding that across the racial spectrum, building a multiracial coalition, including progressive white voters, is how we look at true transformation of the country. That's the potential of what we can offer this year.
Okay. Let me ask you this. And first of all, I just know that I was getting a little message. So can everybody hear me clear? If so, thumbs up. You all hear me clear. You hear me clear, right?
I do.
Yes. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Let's dig a little bit deeper. I mean, the obvious conversation that people have is Joe Biden. He said he's going to pick a woman to be VP, and we can get into all that. But I'm more interested, I think a lot of people should be focused on those lower ticket races. Where will women play a difference in, say, Senate races? So let's hone in on some of the races and some of the potential victories that women can deliver going into the 2020 election. How are you seeing it line up outside of the Joe Biden, Trump race, but the Senate, key congressional districts, all that?
We've got to have our minds focused, as you were saying, not only on the White House, but on the federal elections and down ballot, down to the state houses. Women of color are the margin of victory in across the board and all the way down ballot. The Democrats, in wresting control of the Senate, the Democrats need 5 wins. They need to flip 5 seats. When we look at those intersect with those states, as I mentioned before, that are more of the quarter of the electorate are women of color. And those states that have key Senate races include Arizona, where you have the former astronaut who's running, but the Democrats in Arizona, which is considered a swing state, are heavily reliant on the Black and brown women who would be going to the polls in November. You have Texas, a Senate race in Texas. You have 2 Senate races up for grabs in Georgia. You have a Senate race
let's come back
Florida.
to Texas. Let's come back to Texas for a minute.
Yeah.
So that would be John Cornyn running?
Yep.
Okay, so how's
that
well,
there's
looking?
A runoff. There's a runoff.
Okay,
in Jay Hager and Cornyn. Yeah.
So how is that looking? Because that's a majority minority state almost, but yet it's still solidly red all the time. So what is the landscape look at that now?
Texas is not solidly red. It's a big misnomer to care. Texas is, as you know, because you live there, huge state. And one of the biggest counties, Harris County, that Houston had. We had our presidential forum that you mentioned at the beginning of our time together at Texas Southern, which is the second largest HBCU Black focused institution of higher learning. And that's in the middle of Harris County in Houston. And Harris County is blue. That's the most diverse and the largest. And basically Harris County could carry many of the margin of victory for statewide races, assuming that the people of color that are eligible to vote in Harris County all get registered, their vote protected, and then they actually come out to vote. If we look at Texas as a whole, I don't even use that term minority, majority, because there's nobody who's the majority anymore in a place like Texas or in our hometown, Oakland, or in California, or many of these states. To call people of color a minority undercuts our political power. And in a place like Texas, where there are 3 million eligible unregistered Latinas who could completely close the gap and turn that whole state, statewide office, Senate, gubernatorial races, and down ballot state legislature, could turn that state blue. Based on what we see in Harris County, we know that's possible in places like El Paso and Dallas on the border. So Texas is one of those really amazing places where people have understood and characterized it because of who's in power as a red state. And I see that changing, but I see that only changing if we put our focus on empowering and making sure to elevate the vote of women of color, the Black and brown women. The women who work in Texas are some of the most talented, fantastic organizers. There's a couple of organizations. The main one, led by women of color, is the Texas Organizing Project. Another organization is called JOLT. These are amazing organizers, and I have a lot of hope for the future of that state.
Now, you were going to mention Georgia, and I'll combine this question with this, because one of the challenges that you face in a place like Texas, you faced it in Georgia, you see it in North Carolina and others, is voter suppression, right? So we were talking before, and you said there's a lot of laws and a lot of obstacles that are being tossed in the middle of this to really try and upend the momentum. You said there's a lot that women have had, women of color in particular. So let's talk about Georgia, the voter suppression there, how that's been fought back, and whether or not those type of tactics would carry over into these other places, Texas and Arizona, North Carolina being among them.
Yeah, I'm going to answer the second one first, which is we can expect consistent and very targeted and strategic attacks on our right to vote in the 22 states where particularly women of color, if we fully vote, would mean a shift in those who's in power. So I think the right to vote and the viability of democracy itself is the thing that we're fighting for more than any one candidate or any one party. I think the other thing that we need to consider is that when you look at Georgia, first, what happened right in 2018 with Stacey Abrams' campaign and a whole big effort on part of organizers like emcee and her statewide organizers of New Georgia majority who are registering voters and talking to voters of color, communities of color, is that we can expand the electorate across race and it will change the landscape. Georgia's political landscape changed. People used to write Georgia off of, remember, Jimmy Carter came from Georgia, but every white candidate who ran as a Democrat statewide would always fall short. Stacey Abrams did fall short, but the number of people, Latino voters were 6 times higher than over the last midterms in 2014. Same with Asian American voters, same with white progressives, and maxed out the number of Black voters. That kind of multiracial coalition building that's possible in Georgia takes us to the brink. And they pulled out every trick in the book, removing people from voter rolls, demanding exact match.
You mean an ID, exact match,
an
ID?
Yeah, if you want to be a vote by mail person, there are 5 steps in Georgia right now, including you have to have a copy of your ID in your application. It's not like in California where the governor just announced everyone's going to get vote by mail ballot and everyone can safely vote and not have to choose between staying healthy in this pandemic and exercising their rights as citizens. That is not the case in Georgia. And so the impediments, the barriers are real. We saw that happen in 2018. So our goal in every one of the swing states that will make a difference in how our country is being governed after the election has got to be expanding the number of people who are in the franchise registering voters and focused so many resources on protecting that vote and making sure people are on the voter rolls and they can exercise their vote. Vote by mail is going to be key to that, but you can't just say, oh, vote by mail for everyone without the infrastructure. And I know that Michigan is a swing state that Trump won by 11,000 votes. The the Secretary of State's implementing vote by mail, but there are so many steps to making that real. Not only making sure everybody gets their ballot, making sure there's a stamp on those ballots, making sure everyone understands the dates, but also making sure culturally we go and we fill out the ballot together. It's not like we're going to a polling place, we're putting in the mail, and we take advantage of the month that we have to make sure that everyone's voting. I'm talking long. I'm very excited about this because people are feeling kind of downtrodden. Right. But I do see a path for us to expand and protect our vote for November.
But what I was concerned about was hearing that in some of these places, they were going to try and make it illegal if third-party folks, and when I mean third-party, let's say me and you decide to go to Texas, which we did a few years ago, and register people. Now, in some places, they would make that against the law, like would be considered a third party. So the type of activism that folks in a place like California, where it's going to be solidly blue, you're going to win by 4.5 million votes. You can send troops to another state. And so they have these barriers that they've been putting up. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of people is like, we'll go to Georgia, we'll go to Arizona, we'll go to these places and help, help with the organizing. And they're being preemptive with the obstacles.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're going to need to think about, and we heard this from Michelle Trumillo, who's head of the Texas Organizing Project, is that those who would take advantage of restricting our right to and access to the vote under cover of the pandemic, people like the governor of Texas, Abbott, has announced that third-party organizations, they cross the line trying to take in-person poll voters and make them vote by mail, would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And that includes activist organizations.
Repeat that again so people really understand what you just said. I don't want that to go over anybody's head.
So the justification for the governor of Texas to prosecute people who are trying to both educate and get communities of people to go from in-person poll voters to vote by mail or unregistered to vote by mail, he has committed to prosecuting because he says it's a fraudulent activity. It is within the rights of every Texas voter to become vote by mail. There's only, I think it's 8 states that have rules that you have to have an excuse to become a vote by mail voter, but not in Texas. The barrier is to discourage those who would organize the community, other women of color. So that's part of it. The other is for those of us who are in California or New York or other places and we have the bandwidth and want to go to a swing state over the next 170 some days. Here's the issue. It isn't safe. The states that have opened up right now include Texas, include Georgia, Florida, Arizona. These are 4 absolutely critical swing states where high voter turnout of women of color is going to make the difference. We believe these states are opening up prematurely. We just heard from Fauci that he agrees that that's dangerous to open these states up, and that a resurgence of COVID may happen that causes the states to close again. So for those of us who live like in the Bay Area, the idea of actually physically going to any of those states it's not necessarily a safe prospect. So now we're in the place where we can be, we're going to have to be creative. We're going to have to use all of our resources and ingenuity to reach people digitally, to help people to register to vote by mail, to make phone calls. And so we see Texas Organizing Project, they're focusing on engaging people from not only in Texas, organizers, but outside of Texas on their phone calls. And the phone calls sound like, how are you? Are you okay? Because our folks have been heavily hit by unemployment or by the health impacts of COVID-19. And so people are thinking about food and shelter and health more than they're thinking about the election. So we have to re-engage people where they're at. And I think the organizers on the ground understand that and are leaning deeply into the digital and the phone calls right now.
Let's move to the Midwest. That was the deciding block in 2016. Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. What does the landscape look like in those places based upon the midterms and the number of women of color that live in those places? Because if you win those 3, if you win 3 of those, 3 of the 4, then you, in theory, you can win.
Yeah, and you're talking about a strategy to win the White House that's based on electoral college votes. And that's really, that is what we need to think about, because 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. It's
but that's because that's because California gave her 4.5 million more votes than Trump. So people need to understand that. New York gave her 2.5 million. Illinois gave her 1.5 million. So you add it up. That's where those numbers came from. But these were solidly blue states. But in Michigan and Ohio, it's a different story. So what does it look like in those places?
The margin is so slim in those states. I mentioned earlier that in Michigan, it's 11,000 votes. But that's a state that Obama won in 2012 for his reelection. Why is it that Trump won that state? It wasn't that there were more Trump supporters than there were Clinton supporters. That was not the case. What was the case was that it was a combination of voter suppression efforts and a lack of engagement with the most critical voters. In the case of Michigan, Black voters, that turned out in 2012 because the campaign spoke to them and worked on the ground did not have the same thing in 2016. You had a campaign in 2016 that did not speak to Black voters and had a lot of hubris and assumed Black voters would come out, most of them Black women. So the margin of victory or the margin of difference is completely, utterly achievable in a place like Michigan if turnout is higher. And when we pulled the numbers in those 3 states, as well as the states in the South and Southwest we've been talking about, when women of color's turnout is 3 to 5% higher than average, then Democrats tend to win. And that's where turnout is going to be important in all 3 of those Midwest states.
So I know we're going to get some questions, but let me ask you this, and this will probably dovetail into the big question about Biden and who he will pick. What we noticed in a place like Ohio was people stood online in the rain for 5, 6, 7 hours to vote. And we can attribute a lot of that to a sense of history being made, Black president, the re-election. We also remember there was the Tea Party situation, and people wanted to kind of put a foot on the neck of those guys and say, we will, push you back. Do we have that sort of enthusiasm going into 2020? Will people, in particular Black voters, stand online in a place like Ohio for 5 or 6 hours to vote for somebody who they may not be fully excited about? And if we're talking about women being the impetus, will they put a woman on the ticket that excites voters? Meaning, will it be a woman of color? Will it be a Black woman? And what is that looking like if those are going to be the types of enthusiasm that needs to be generated to win an election in some of these key places?
Yeah, I mean, we should change the way that we think about long lines. Long lines are a function of voter suppression.
Yes.
It means that all the decision makers from the county election boards all the way up had allowed in places where a lot of people vote on election day, and we know where those places are, do not have enough places to vote. You saw, though, that in the middle of the pandemic, you saw the Black women standing in line in the middle of a hailstorm in Wisconsin. We already saw that happened. We know that some people are willing to risk their health to exercise, but it is that long lines are a function of voter suppression. And so one is that we need to, the structure, electoral structure of voting, we need to make sure that people have a fair chance at voting. But the other thing that you point to is key. How Democrats are going to win in November is a function of both organizing prowess, and we talked about how that's being threatened under the pandemic. There's nobody knocking doors right now. It's going to be phone calls and digital. And on the other hand, you do need at the top of the ticket people that excite and inspire. Joe Biden, who essentially it was older Black voters, particularly Black women, who in the South, who basically pulled his DOA campaign out of the grave and like, okay, you're going to be the person. And so there's not a lot of enthusiasm when you think of general election voters, younger voters. And so in a lot of the states where Biden won in the primary, he doesn't have an infrastructure. He's no organizing infrastructure. And that's really, really dangerous. So we're going to be relying on enthusiasm or anti-Trump sentiment. The fact of the matter is you need someone on the ticket who's going to be able to speak to people of color, a woman who's going to be able to excite and who's going to inspire, who has a bigger vision of what we're trying to do in this country, who can reach across racial divides and bring us together, who can talk in the South. I mean, honestly, remember, Joe Biden's from Delaware. We need someone in where people of color's center of gravity is, which is in the South and Southwest.
So who do you think he'll pick? Stacey Abrams? Do you think he'll pick Kamala Harris? Do you think he'll pick Amy Klobuchar because she's in the Midwest and those Rust Belts? And then we have this, and then the wild card is we have the documentary with Michelle Obama, who popped up, And, and folks are sitting there going, if Michelle just would run. Now, people that know her is like, nah, she's not about that political life like that. But the documentary has a lot of people going, if she would just be the VP pick, it would be a game changer. So what are you hearing? What are you thinking? What are you seeing?
3 months
I think
ago,
he's going to pick Amy Klobuchar.
I hope you're wrong, because Amy Klobuchar
I hope I am too, but I
Amy
think he's going to
Klobuchar
do
is
it.
part of the calculus that prioritizes white voters and moderate white voters over everyone else. It needs to
Right.
be someone who's politically more progressive, needs to be someone who speaks to multiracial coalition. When we polled our folks, women of color in the early primary state of Nevada, Amy Klobuchar was polling at 1%.
Okay.
So I think that would be a
how
strategic
about
mistake.
Elizabeth Warren?
Let me
Okay.
first say,
Yeah.
when we asked our 1,000 women nationally in the She the People Network who should be the woman of color as a VP, Stacey Abrams bubbled up to the top as the top pick, and Kamala Harris was a number 2. We cannot have an all-white ticket. We know what that looks like. It looks like 2016. That is not representative of the party that most are in. Remember, it's half people of color, a quarter women of color. And it's not just any woman of color. I'm not saying that, but I am saying someone who can speak to and bring together and coalesce a coalition is the one that can do it, especially if Stacey Abrams comes. She understands how to expand the electorate.
Yeah.
She gets that, and how to protect the vote. So
do any of them have skeletons that have been pulled out to make sure that there's no 11th hour, tricks? Like, one of the things that hobbled Kamala Harris was, people pulled out and looked at her as a DA and looked at her not willing to prosecute cops, and then they, that hung on, and she didn't address that. So do any of these potentials have things that they need to get out the way?
Listen, Kamala Harris was being held to a higher standard than Amy Klobuchar, who you mentioned. Amy
Yeah.
Klobuchar
Was a prosecutor too.
Was
Yeah.
a prosecutor, and in the case she handled, was in direct violation to the idea that Black people should have due process and be treated fair. Listen, and she was never questioned about that. And I think because of the structural problems of having Iowa and New Hampshire, the first states, as the validators of who's got momentum, Amy Klobuchar stayed in the race a long time. Whereas if the first states were Nevada and South Carolina, I believe Kamala Harris would have had a chance to go further, because that really represents more of the base of the party than Iowa and New Hampshire. Now, having said that, we have Stacey Abrams ran for governor. Even the Democratic Party in Georgia tried to stop her back when ran somebody against her. There was a lot of opposition research done, not only with her, but Kamala Harris, who's a senator. These are people that have vied for or held office. I think everyone should be accountable, but I also think women of color are bringing something, not only the ability to deliver victory, but who are carrying a lot of people with them in a time where our country really needs it. That's where I think we need to go.
Okay, and lastly, and then we'll open up for questions. What would you ask people that are watching all over the country to do right now? What are their marching orders? They're in the middle of a pandemic, so mobility is limited. They can't jump on a plane and go door to door. And maybe they shouldn't. Maybe we need to find ways to empower the populations in these places. But what would you ask folks to do at this point?
Make sure everybody votes. We're all in California, we're all getting ballots, as I mentioned. They need to have a plan to make sure their people actually fill out that ballot and get those in, so we can impact our local and our state. It's not like California has all of our problems solved. We're going to have millions and millions of destitute people that haven't been able to work and won't have a job to go back to in this foreseeable future. So we have business to take care of ourselves. But I would say the bigger thing is there are organizations who can plug in to remote volunteer efforts, and I think this is where we need to go. The organizations, Texas Organizing Project, One Arizona, New Georgia Project, New Florida Majority. These are examples of groups that are led by women of color that could use volunteer and dollars in order to do the work that must be done in a very, very difficult time. There is a role for all of us. And we also need people to support and help to promote the vision that women of color who have been ignored by both parties, who have been dismissed, and who also felt the pain of what this country has done, not just since Trump took office, but for a long time. It's our time because we're closest to the pain, and we're closest to the solutions that the country needs. So it's all of those things I think people can contribute and be part of. Ultimately, it's a multiracial coalition that needs to come together to get us out of the trouble we're in and to lead the country forward.
Okay. Well, there you have it. I have a few more, but let's get some questions in.
So actually, most of the questions that have been sent in, you've addressed in some way or another. I would just say, do you have any very specific advice for where to go if you're a person in California that wants to help other states? What are some organizations that people could reach out to, especially because we can't travel to them?
So I would say in Arizona, and these are Googleable, you can Google them. One Arizona is the organization that's really heading up the voter registration and engagement efforts to close I believe it's 70,000 vote gap in order and so you can actually be part of a program in Arizona that has a Senate seat up and is going to be really important. Thank you very much for that. onearizona.org. In Texas, we've been talking a lot about Texas. The Texas Organizing Project works a lot in Harris County, but has a statewide plan to register and get out to vote, millions of people on the ground in Texas, a very important state. In Georgia, the organization is New Georgia Project. A New Georgia Project registers voters, talks to voters, and is engaged in this monumental effort to get Georgia voters to vote by mail so they can be safe and also participate in the upcoming elections. They have a primary coming up in June, so now is a good time to get involved. In Florida, another swing state, it's less than 1% vote gap. Trump won Florida last time. What will happen this time if women of color turn out in higher numbers? I think New Florida Majority is another one that you can plug into. All of them have opportunities remotely for you to be involved. So I think for all of us, I think ultimately for She the People, as we knit together a network of networks of women of color led efforts to fight for democracy and to actually get people to vote, this is very important. So I also want to invite people to go to shethepeople.org, sign up, give what you can in terms of your own resources, time, and support. And I think all of those together will help to contribute to what's a national movement led by women.
Are there key issues that stand out amongst the women that you've been polling that they look at and go, this is the reason why? And how do those issues fare with the type of scandal that's been plaguing Joe Biden, with the sexual assault thing? How is that, weighing when we look at that? Because the Me Too movement was started by women of color, had a lot of momentum. And here we have, people having to deal with, a potential contradiction, in terms of what he's been about and the actions that were taken in the past and what they're looking at with these two candidates who both have that issue at hand.
Yeah. I mean, you're bringing up, first of all, let me just say, women of color, not 100% of all of us, it's not even about that, but we coalesce around issues of economic, racial, and gender justice. And that includes many of us remembering the way that Anita Hill was treated. Here's this young, brave law professor coming to tell the truth about a boss who had sexually harassed her at work. And the way that Joe Biden, in his leadership role on that Senate committee, dismissed her and treated her. That was that made a big impression to me and a lot of us. And so to be able to tell the truth and hold the powerful to account is a very important part of the movement. I think where we're at right now is we're going to have to figure out, because I don't think women of color can make up for or account for all the misdeeds, but we can certainly organize ourselves and hold the powerful to account to the extent that we can. I think that the VP candidate on the Biden ticket is going to have to be able to speak to some of those larger issues, because I think that's going to continue to be important. When we look at the issues that women of color were responsive to the times we've come out to our network, it's healthcare. Healthcare is number one. And that was before the pandemic. Having access to healthcare, it was strong support for Medicare for all. On the other hand, it's racism. Women of color, and now we see what's happening in the Asian American community. We see the abuse of migrants. We see the murders of Black people
Even
in the street. We just
especially
see
during
that
the pandemic.
That's right.
Right now in
So
the pandemic, that's angering.
Right. So we want, as women of color, one of the issues is to have leaders that can speak authentically to and have a plan to address the rise of white nationalism and racism that's built into our system that allows these kind of abuses to happen unchecked.
But let's talk about the economy now, with everybody out of work and people being very desperate. How's that going to play into this election, especially if you have somebody who can control some of the levers of power and go, oh, you know what, in the swing state, let's make sure everybody gets a check. And, you're so desperate that you might just go, well, thank you, Mr. Trump, for that check. And we appreciate it. And because there is a play for Black and brown voters in many of these swing states. You don't see it in California as much, but you definitely see it in those places. And, if you're winning by the margins, 3 or 4 here, 4 or 5 there can make all the differences. So with people desperate for work and what's going to be the economic, how will the economics factor in? That's what I was looking for into this election right now.
Yeah. It's women of color are most likely to be essential workers. We've been dying at high rates, and Black and brown communities have higher unemployment, and it's already astronomically high. We're likely to suffer the economic impact of what's happening now for a very long time. And we're just getting started. People are like, oh, we're going to go into a recession. Recession is a specific term about a short-term downturn, slowdown of the economy. What we're looking at is profound and long-lasting economic disaster for many of us. So the economy and just basic food and shelter needs are going to be important. If you look at what's being considered in the House right now, despite the best efforts of Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, who's arguing for sustained $2,000 payments through the pandemic, for forgiving student loan debt and other things that would help our community, doesn't seem to be the political will at this moment, although there's still an opportunity to have a package that's going to meet the need. I think that's where our focus needs to be in terms of that. If the administration wasn't so incompetent and cruel, then maybe they could use those checks as a lever for, like you were suggesting. But my friends who are small business people in some of the states we've been talking about, no one they know got a paycheck protection grant, which is a small business grant. And then when they did the numbers, they found that, the entrepreneurs and small business people who employ most people in the country didn't receive federal aid. And it was based a lot on race. So when you look at that, you're saying if there was a play for people's votes or support, then they
do it. What about young voters? So in Michigan, what we saw, and in to a certain degree in Wisconsin, voter suppression just was not applied to Black folks. It was young voters as well who suddenly found themselves not being able to vote, for example, on their college campus. Remember, there were rules put in place like, hey, I know you live in Oakland now, but you got to vote in LA, would be the equivalent to how they were doing it for young voters, first-time voters, people who are just turning 18, all that sort of stuff. So, and then you got to couple that with enthusiasm. So how do you feel that women of color will speak to young voters and even young women of color?
Yeah. For all the 19-year-olds, the majority of women are women of color. So to say women of color is to talk about the majority of young women. It's synonymous. And there's, I think for this next generation coming up, there needs to be a concerted effort to register and engage. It's a real weakness for the current presumptive nominee in terms of appealing to young voters. And it seems like younger voters really want to see substantive change, and they're not inspired by a politics that says, hey, we're going to go back to, a couple of years ago, or we're going to think real small about what this country is. So I just think on a very practical basis, there's voter suppression, but there's also ignoring, a lack of engagement for younger voters.
But it's also an opportunity for organizers, people listening, people that you have brought to the table with She the People, to do that above and beyond the candidates. So do you all have plans to engage those young voters? Like, how are you, Aimee, going to get these young voters?
I think part of it is in engaging our network of networks that includes some pretty amazing young women who are organizing at the state level. We had identified 20 outstanding women of color that were going to be key to engaging voters in 2020. One of them is Katherine Quinn, who's a youth organizer out of Florida. She made our list of 20 for 2020 because she is leading this effort and focusing. These are the kind of people that are in our broader network, and our goal is to both knit together this network and also to uplift the work that they're doing so that they see more resources and more focus and more power behind the work that they're doing.
Can you talk a little bit about the 20 for 20? We should have brought that up because that is the program that you were doing to highlight a lot of these young leaders who, are, they can all run for themselves, really. So talk a little bit about that, and who are some of these bright stars we should be looking for and supporting?
Some of them I've mentioned, Texas Organizing Project, Michelle Tremillo, and Andrea Mercado in Florida, Florida New Majority, and Monse Arenot in Arizona are just three of those leaders. We also have Stacey Abrams, who's now, when I met her, she wasn't famous, but now she's on the short list for VP, and she's leading a big organization to protect our vote called Fair Fight. Stacey Abrams on there. And so you can go to shethepeople.org and look at the list. I'd follow all of these women, every single one. For example, Jennifer Epps Addison, who's the co-director of the Center for Popular Democracy. They have a plan to activate 500,000 voters. And in the proud tradition of women of color, we figure out how to make $1 out of 50 cents. We're in the middle of a pandemic with great attacks on our rights, and yet these are the creative women who are going to figure out how we're going to get our people.
You also had the woman that was running for Senate. What's her name again? You're going to go on my wife walking by, but that's a friend in Texas. Cynthia who? Christina Sensun in Texas that ran in the runoff. So that's another one.
I'm a fan of Christina, and we're going to see more of her in Texas. We are absolutely. Christina Sensun Ramirez is somebody to follow and watch in terms of coming out of the Jolt family as an organizer into elected leadership. And she's still in her 30s, so she's one of our leaders that we should look for too.
So, just thinking of Christina, because that's a friend of my wife. So that's why I was like, oh, that's her buddy. What about the Latino women? I know you kind of touched up on it, but that seems like that's a key part of the equation for 2020. So how are you seeing that, especially in a place like Arizona, which folks are trying to flip? I don't know how that translates into Florida, but Georgia surprisingly had the large or growing Latino population. So how is that coming into focus now?
Not surprising at all. The Latinx community, Latinas are going to be an amazingly powerful part of our political future, shaping our political future, and have not been engaged, as I was saying, by the political system and the parties and the campaigns in a way that respects how many people are eligible to vote. This is going to be a key voting block to register and engage in Arizona for sure. And in places in the South, in places in the Midwest, this is important. It's part of the reason that Stacey Abrams' campaign was so powerful, because she had on staff organizers who would go deep within Latinx community as well as other communities, Asian American community, and Vietnamese community, and really just find and engage and speak to and get involved the people in those communities so they can come out to vote. So I think that's going to be the key.
What about Indigenous women? That's often ignored. You have like the Navajo country, which in New Mexico to Arizona, it's huge. How are they being engaged, and what's been the polling saying for them?
I think we have to acknowledge that Native women have been organizing around issues for a really long time. And it was because of, and I think this was catalyzed by an anti-Trump sentiment, as well as by, such a long history of effective activism, that we see Native women taking the lead and being responsible for victories, not only bringing the first 2 Native women into Congress, but also solidifying the fact that the turnout was higher in 2018, and we're expecting turnout to be higher in 2020. Now, the pandemic is no joke. I think that's going to be the thing in the places where the Native vote. We need to have vote by mail and other alternative methods, because the voter suppression in Native communities is very, very intense.
Now, in organizing, we often see a coastal bias. We live in California, a lot of foundations, a lot of grant money, a lot of that sort of comes out. You see that in New York, and subsequently, you see a lot of people in these places feel like the whole world is very similar to where we're at. So we're in Cali, and we figure that they're going to think the same way in Wisconsin. They're going to think and have the same values in Ohio. Are we going to move, or do you see a move to decenter some of these coastal cities in terms of political organizing, and really start to focus in on the unique challenges, the unique strategies that are deployed in the South and some of these other places, where they have a seat at the table without being overshadowed by some of the hubris that we bring from coastal places?
Yeah, I'm very proud to be from Oakland. I'm not going to lie. Our greatest export of Oakland, California, is multiracial organizing for women, and it also means that we have a lot to learn from organizers who have been operating in very tough circumstances for a long time. The Black women in the South who are inspiration in terms of their expertise and what they can show the rest of the country. And the brand of progressivism that's really grounded in organizing, in inclusiveness, and in expressing personal and collective power, that's the kind of thing that is something that everyone should be learning from. So yeah, we need to center women in the South and Southwest. It's the work that I do. A lot of our events have been, in Miami, in Richmond, Virginia, at HBCUs. And, we need to create a network that values the expertise of the women in the South and Southwest. In the Bay, we have things that we can offer, but we are part of a national network, and the real growth of the progressive movement is coming from the South. And the more that we can, we know who's there, and we can follow and celebrate the leadership and the strategic excellence of the women of color in those places in our country, I think the more powerful we all will be.
How much of a role has the church and religious organizations played in this organizing? You know, again, one of the things I've seen when we go into coastal places is like people like, nah, I don't need to be bothered with the church. That was maybe a critique we saw with the Sanders campaign when he went into South Carolina. It's like, yeah, I don't need to go. And well, you know, others did, and they realized that the church is a big deal in some of these places. So how is that factored into some of this organizing that you've been doing with women? It might skew a little bit older, but nevertheless, those are institutions that you can't ignore, or you ignore at your peril.
Yeah, but I think it depends on what age, and I think it depends on where. We've worked with groups that organize in churches, but the assumption is some political parties and candidates have that, for example, the way to reach Black voters is to go to church. That's true, but to a lesser and lesser extent over time. I think it's important to understand the role the church community has in early voting, the souls to the polls and that kind of thing.
But
I think it's one component.
doesn't Biden owe his victory because of that demographic? I mean, in Texas, definitely. I mean, it was all church folks that came out, and they made it clear, like they was in the churches. Definitely South Carolina. So I'm just asking because sometimes that gets ignored, and Sanders' campaign, it was kind of like we'll ignore it, and he ain't the nominee as a result.
Yeah,
All to the South.
Yeah, I think Bernie Sanders had some challenges in terms of building relationships with Southern Black people, especially women, and wasn't able to overcome that, even though he'd basically been continuing to run since 2015. Those relationships, the relationships of longevity, people who show up, it matters a lot. And I think you're right. I think the church is very important. It should factor in. When we look at someone like Donna Thompson, who was one of our 20 for 2020, she worked in Alabama. In 2017, she organized with churches, but she also organized with historically Black colleges and universities and other groups in order to activate the Black community. The church is one slice of it. It isn't the whole pie.
Okay. Well thought. Elizabeth, I think you were saying something to me. I couldn't hear. Go ahead.
Oh, no, that's fine. But we've done a full hour now, so I think we're going to have to wrap it up. I do want to get one more question in from the audience, and hopefully we can make this quick. It's a question about Bernie Sanders being perceived as too progressive by the Democratic Party. And then how does that translate into a Black progressive woman being the ideal candidate for the Democratic ticket if Sanders was considered too progressive? What do you say to someone who asks you that?
I had Senator Sanders on stage with us last April for our presidential forum, and he really did struggle on that stage a year ago in answering a simple question about what his responsibility as president would be to address the rise of white nationalist violence. Now that was not a gotcha question, but I also think that it was maybe the first time for all those presidential candidates to be in front of 2,000 women of color as a voting bloc, and I don't think it's the same thing as to say Bernie Sanders equals anyone who identifies as progressive who happens to be a Black woman. I do think there is differences in terms of having a candidate to be able to speak about gender justice and racial justice from a place of having personal experience. There's value to that, and I think the voters respond to that, can respond to that. So I don't think the issue is that we don't need a progressive on the national stage, on the national ticket. I think for the Democratic Party, which is a big tent, Biden represents one part of the Democratic Party, which is more moderate, more establishment. There's all these other people. And remember, women of color are the most progressive voters, the most loyal Democrats of any other race and gender, and have demonstrated it time and time again. So in order for women of color to come out and be inspired, the person on the ticket needs to embrace a progressive politics. No one's perfect, but they need to embrace a progressive politics and be able to speak authentically to the multiracial coalition, the New American Majority, that will ultimately lead to victory.
But in speaking to that, we're talking about key issues, right? So what are we talking about? Student loan forgiveness? We're talking about Medicare for all, or is there something else that defines that progressivism?
Yeah, I think all of those things. I mean, She the People works with organizations who develop policy, and we can argue about what the details of a policy are. But when you think back, it seems like a million years ago. You think back to the presidential primary. Remember, there were a couple of candidates who embraced, having everyone have access to medical care, regardless of employment status. That's what they argued, whatever they called it. And then there were candidates who said, "No, we got to kind of stick with the system we have now." Those arguments seem ridiculous in a time of pandemic where you have record unemployment and people losing their health benefits. And so the center of gravity, I believe, is going to move. And that's the good news is the possibility for what can come out of that is that voters and average people will support a more progressive approach to making sure that people get the health care they need.
And they might not be scared of the word socialism.
Yeah.
Ain't that something, right?
True.
Everybody's a socialist now. With my check, with my stimulus package, but that's just me. That's just,
All right. Well, thank you both so much for this conversation. And for those of you who thought it was only going to be 30 minutes, we gave you a whole hour. So you're welcome.
Yeah, we had the kids be quiet. They're sitting there.
Thank you, Aimee, and thank you, Davey, for all the work that you do. Please
Thank you.
Check out shethepeople.org and see what the work that Aimee is doing. You can find out more about Davey at kpfa.org. And also, please take a minute to support MOAD if you are enjoying these programs and want to see more of them. Next week, we'll be partnering with the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts for a program on Black women and the Census Project called See Black Women. Look for details on that on the MOAD website. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you for, saving our democracy and everything that you do. I appreciate you.
I appreciate
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Peace, everybody.